Well, I'm really happy to invite Pastor Carel Smith and Dr. Willie back to our podcast. And today is going to be a very interesting day. What we'll be touching on is, and I want to be a bit more controversial, broken heels, towers and mighty hunters. In other words, we're going to look at the Tower of Babel. And not only the Tower of Babel, but lift out a couple of things around language, confusion of languages. But I actually wanted to start off and ask Willie, if you look at the Tower of Babel and you look at Nimrod, was it an actual historical event? And did it actually take place? And I think if we can also touch on where might it have been located.
So it's, as always, a pleasure to be talking about these very interesting things. I think when one reads the Bible and one reads the story about the Tower of Babel, then for some people, it's in their way of thinking from a Western perspective. I think they imagine an enormously high tower. There's some paintings I've seen about such a tower going up high into heaven. And one has that concept in your mind. You've seen some of these pictures of like the painters. On the other hand, one have some scholars more from a liberal orientation that would say this is just a story. There are no historical grounds for the story. It evolved late in Israel's history. In fact, this is the more general view that one will find in the biblical criticism school of thinking, and that's what's been taught at most seminaries and so on, which is aligned with major universities. If the seminary is more aligned to some particular churches, so it won't be the case, but if they're aligned with major universities, that's most likely this will be their point of view.
Willie, can I interrupt and just ask, why do you think there's this shift that took place? Because I am seeing this more and more. It's almost like a denial of the fact that it could possibly have been an historical event. So there's no discussion or analysis around it. It's just this is fact, and they ignore the rest.
Yeah, so this is not something that originated yesterday. You know, the view that is critical about the biblical stories, it's an old view. It's actually more than 100 years old. 200 years goes back a long time. And this is the view that says that we should be critical about the biblical stories because most likely it's just traditions. And slowly but steadily, the view originated that this part of Genesis was written during the Babylonian exile or even later. And if that's the case, obviously there can't be any historical value to these things, these stories. So they don't believe there's any historical incidents behind this story. Now, I myself, I believe we have actually very good reason to think otherwise. And not simply because I'm more conservative in my views, but because I've made an extensive study of the ancient world, and especially the ancient Sumerian world, where we find these exact same motives. And I've actually formulated what I call the Sumerian Hypothesis, or hypothesis that had been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and so it's been accepted as academically sound. And in this perspective, I'm arguing for a totally different view. So what I'm saying is that these stories that we find especially in the primeval history, that's Genesis 1 to 11, they originated not in the period of the Babylonian exile, but they go back to ancient Sumer. And the way that they have been handed down is through the Abrahamic family. And I have shown that we have good reason to believe that Abraham was indeed an historical person. And as always in the critical school, they don't believe that Abraham is an historical person. So there's a lot of argument before one can come to this point. But once we've shown that in all regards, in every aspect, and this is we have done through these talks, we've shown that from Genesis 1, and we've now moved quite a bit on through these stories, we've shown that there's not only an historical base to these stories, but that these stories, we have good reason to believe that they are true. Sometimes we read and understand these stories in a modern context, and that's not correct, because obviously it was a very different background, a very different milieu. Those people had a different frame of mind, totally different frame of mind. And when it comes to the story of the Tower of Babel, in the kind of period where we could locate this story, there are no such high towers that we see in the pictures. It's just not what we should think about. We should think in a totally different way. It was a large platform, massive temple platform, and but it was not even the ziggurat. That's this with the various layers one above the other, didn't exist at that period. So it was a massive platform, temple platform, and there was on top of that was a holy place, but it was not the kind of tower what people often have in mind when they read this story. So although the story behind this story in the Bible is definitely historical in my view, that the way that people understand the story, interpret the story, in my view, is not always correct. In most cases, because they don't have a good understanding of the ancient world from which the Bible originated, their way of understanding is not correct. And when it comes to the confusion of language, we'll talk about that also later on today. I also believe the same is true. Yeah.
Willie, maybe I must just ask you one question about what you just mentioned. If you look at Genesis 11, verse 4, and they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So they did mention that they want to build a tower with its top in the heavens. Although you say it doesn't necessarily mean that it was very high, maybe it rather meant there was a connection between the heavenlies and the earth.
Yeah, so the idea behind this enormous platform was in fact to reach towards the heavens, because it, in some sense, symbolized the mountain of the gods. That's the place where we reach up in heaven towards God. So that was the symbolism behind this enormous building. And it was indeed a very high platform and a massive structure, but tower is not really the right translation, I believe.
Can you make the case that, I mean, some scholars refer to the mountain of God, and some will say that the Garden of Eden was on top of God's mountain, that this is sort of a human representation of that, and basically to, I almost want to say, get closer to the firmament.
Yeah, so I definitely think so. I think the underlying motive for building this tower, or this massive platform thing, was in fact to, in some way, produce an image of the mountain of God. As in biblical terms, we will speak about the mountain of gods, but in terms of the ancient world from which it originated, we will be speaking about the mountain of the gods. So it's the mountain of the gods. That's the picture. That's why it reaches up in heaven. That's in a certain sense, it's a ladder taking us towards heaven. And slowly but steadily, the 7 layers were included in this building, and that's where the ziggurat originated. In about, I would say, in about the Akkadian period. That's quite a few hundred years after the period we're talking about now. So I placed this event, this Tower of Babel and the confusion of language, in the so-called Uruk period in the Sumerian civilization. And the reason why I do this has primarily to do with the flood or the deluge. We've spoken about the deluge previously. So the question is, where does the deluge fit in? So that's the most basic question before we start any discussion, because that is sort of a starting point from where we can take a point of reference. Now, I take the deluge, the biblical deluge, as well as the stories about the deluge that we find in Babylonian, Akkadian, and Sumerian sources, as going back to the flood layer that had been discovered by Sir Willie in Ur. It's many meters thick, and it was not only found at Ur, it was found at various other places throughout ancient Mesopotamia. So, but we've already spoken about that. So that's my point of reference. So after that comes the Uruk period. So it's within the Uruk period that we find these events. So in my view, what we read in the Bible is after the flood, a man called Kish came down to Sumer and he settled there. And he had a son called Nimrod. Now it's interesting in the biblical story that I believe, can connect Nimrod with the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Now that relates to his name, which is often taken as being derived from Marat to rebel. And the story about the Tower of Babel is basically a story about the rebellion against God.
I just wanted to add there as well. Sorry for interrupting, Willie.
Yeah,
and if you look at an extra biblical source, Josephus says, now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. And he persuaded them not to ascribe to God as if it were through his means. They were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. Interesting.
Yeah, so it's definitely part of Jewish tradition,
yeah,
that Nimrod was the one who built the tower. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go back to the Uruk period, where does he actually feature as a very specific individual? And if we look at the confusion of languages, how does that feature in that time period as well?
Yeah, so let's first look at the personages. The first person I've just mentioned is Kish, coming down and settling in Sumer. The Bible, it's called Shinar. Now, Shinar is just corresponds with Sumer in secular history. Sumer is just the southern part of Mesopotamia between the two rivers, the part close towards the Persian Gulf. At that stage, the Persian Gulf were actually quite a few hundred or more than 100 kilometers higher than today. It was, well, it's just a meter or what, because the world is very level in that area. So a slight dip in the sea level actually moves the sea back quite a distance. So the sea has moved back more than 100 kilometers from where these things happened. But at that stage, it was in the southern marshes where the rivers entered the Persian Gulf. And it was in this area that these areas were dried out and where this sanctuary was built. And now the person that after the flood that came down and settled in this area, according to the Bible, is Kish. Now I believe we should, and he had a son called Nimrod. Now I believe that we should connect Kish with a corresponding person in Sumerian tradition, namely Meshkiach Kasher. So here we have Kash as the key part of the name, Kash corresponding with Kish. And he also, same tradition is found in Sumer. We believe that according to the tradition, he came down from the northern mountains. We've discussed that in that, I think it was in our discussion on the deluge. And he settled in Sumer, and he had a son called Enmerkar. Now, Enmerkar, according to Sumerian tradition, was the one that built the city of Uruk. That was the great city of Uruk. It's the same city that Nimrod ruled over. Very important. That was the only important city in Sumer during that period. No other important city. So if Nimrod ruled after the deluge, excuse me, That's the only important city that he could have ruled over. And then the other less important cities. And the other important place was actually Eridu, to the south of Uruk. And that was regarded as the oldest sanctuary in ancient Mesopotamia. And we read that he rebuilt it. So presumably after the deluge, it was destroyed and he rebuilt it. And this is where this massive platform was erected in the time of Enmerkar. Now, what's interesting about Enmerkar, he doesn't only correspond on many, many other points. According to the Bible, Nimrod was a great, he was a violent person. He was a great warrior. He extended his empire far to the north, beyond Nineveh, towards the north, distant north. Exactly the same is true regarding Enmerkar. Excuse me. So he also did the same things. He also ruled. It was in that time, or directly after that period, that we start seeing a large expansion of the Uruk Sumerians during the end of the Uruk period of the Sumerian civilization towards all parts of Mesopotamia. So there's a lot of correspondences over there. Even the name in Enmerkar. So we have the consonants and we have the vowels. Now the vowels are not, handed down correctly. Usually it changes quite often, but the consonants stay the same, and that's why we call those the root of the word, the consonants. Often one finds that the vowels are even left out, as also we find in Hebrew, it's just the consonants that's been handed down. So in the case of Enmerkar, if we leave out the kar, then we have NMR, which is exactly the same kind of. Yeah, Nimrod is spelled also in that way. So there's good reason to believe that the Enmerkar of the Sumerian tradition corresponds with the Nimrod of biblical tradition.
So definitely strong parallels between the Sumerian tradition and the Jewish and biblical tradition.
Yeah, so there's a close correspondence. But the main question before us is Babel.
Yes.
The Tower of Babel. It was this large platform was actually built in Eridu. Towards the south, it was the primeval sanctuary in Sumer, the most important one, according to tradition, the oldest one. But why would the Bible call it Babel? That's a big question. And now what is important is that Babylon was not important during that period. It's not mentioned at all.
Yeah.
So whether it existed, maybe it's a very small town, we do not know, but played no role whatsoever during that early period. But Babel later on, during the Babylonian period, when the Amorites, the Babylonians, settled in Babel, or in Babylon, they took over the myths and the ideas and the religion from Eridu. And they called Babel, or Babylon, Ninki. Now, Ninki is exactly the same name that Eridu had been called. So in the cuneiform script, Eridu is written as Ninki. It's quite interesting. Ki is just a marker, so to say. We call it determinative. It just says it's a place. And Nin, in this case, in my view, refers to a fountain, a deep fountain, the deep. So in Sumerian tradition, we read about a beautiful fountain that was presumably a lot of meters deep, and that flowed out in this particular area in the marshes. And this is where the sanctuary was built, and that was why it was called Ninki. And Babylon took over the name. And that's why we also found later on, for example, Boroses and so on, they, when referring to Eridu, they call it Babylon or Babel. And that's exactly what we find in the Bible. So what we find is, obviously, Ninki is a cuneiform form of writing, so you don't pronounce it in that way. So the way that the biblical author thought it should be pronounced was Babel or Babylon. but it is actually Eridu. It goes back even before Babylon, much earlier towards Eridu.
And yeah, so to take it a bit forward, if you look at Babel, of course, the big thing that, or the situation that happened was the confusion of languages. And in one of the articles that you wrote, you referred to Enki and Endel and the conflict between the two of them. So I actually have two questions that I wanted to ask Carel if he's got any questions around that, as well as, I think the first one, if you look at Enki and Endel, where do they fit into the bigger picture? And then the second one is, if you look at Nimrod as a character in this whole cosmic play, what was the purpose of the tower at the end of the day, and why did God come down personally to deal with the situation, if I can put it that way?
Well, you asked questions. Maybe really what interested me was the purpose of that temple at Eridu and the role Enki played. It seemed that he was one of the main gods honored or worshipped there. And it has a lot to do with the whole scenario of the languages, the Tower of Babel, the conflict. But maybe we can start to talk about the role of Enki at that temple.
Yeah, so he was the god of Enki, of Eridu. He was the main god of the Sumerians during that very early period. Later on, other gods became important, but he was the main god of the Sumerians. And what is interesting is in the Sumerian tradition, we find something very similar to what we read in the Bible. In the Bible, we read about the confusion of language. Now we read about exactly the same thing in Sumerian tradition. It's called Nudimut's spell. Nudimut is just another name for Enki. So it's Enki's spell. And what happened, according to tradition, is that he cast a certain kind of spell. That's how it was handed down in the Sumerian tradition. And what happened is this, in effect, led to this confusion of language. Now, let me read it to you from the Sumerian text, translation, obviously. In the whole compass of heaven and earth, the people entrusted to him could address Enlo. Now, Enlo, that's the son of the supreme god, most likely, in my view, corresponding with the form of El. So the whole world worshipped El, or Enlo, verily in but a single tongue. Now the Lord of Eridu, that's Enki, we've just spoken about him, and strangled the tongues in their mouths, as many as were put there, the tongues of men that was one. So here we find exactly the same event being described in Sumerian tradition. So in this case, it's a slightly different perspective than what we find in the Bible. According to the Bible, it was God who confused the people's language to stop them building. So there it was God that was the author and had this purpose to stop them building this tower. Now, this is not necessarily in conflict with the Sumerian tradition, because one could still say that at the end of the day that God used this in this manner. But here we find that Enki was actually jealous. It seems to be having been jealous about people worshiping God. And he didn't like it. So what he did, he strangled the tongues in their mouths, as many as were put there, if I can just repeat it. So what is interesting is that some of the Sumerian scholars has actually read this in an interesting way. For example, Samuel Noah Kramer, he wrote a very provocative essay called Enki and his Inferiority Complex.
Interesting
So
title.
Yeah. And what he says here is that the story of the confusion of language reflects a power struggle between Enlil and Enki. So he's quite clear about this. So there's a larger picture of a conflict between gods. And this story about the Tower of Babel, or then what happened at this ancient sanctuary at Eridu, something happened. And this resulted in a confusion, a massive confusion, and it led to the people stopping, to stop building this massive temple and to stop the worship there at that place and to become dispersed over the ancient world. Now, this is exactly what we find archaeologically wise. So we find at the end of the Uruk period, suddenly something happened. And everything was just left as is, and the people dispersed. Now, what could this event have been? This event that's also described in the Sumerian context, and it's also in the text that this came from is actually a text that refers to Enmerkar. It's about a story about him in which this is referred to. So in Enmerkar, which we equated with the biblical Nimrod, it's exactly this person that is linked here with this particular spell of Enki, the confusion of language. So the question before us is actually what happened? What happened in ancient Sumer that was remembered as the confusion of language in both the biblical and the Sumerian traditions?
Yeah, there many people believe that this was actually, or understand the Bible, that this was the place where the different languages of the world originated. And after I read your article, you said that it is not the case.
Yeah, some people believe, that this is the only right way to read the Bible. That this meant that God created languages at that particular point in history. And that's quite a general view among Christians. But the reason why they read it in this way is, again, as I've mentioned previously, they see this picture about the tower, they have seen some painting about it. And they have somewhere during the last whensoever, it so happened that this particular view gained ground and become the dominant view. But obviously, it's a view that developed in a world that is totally divorced from the ancient world in which this event happened. So we should go back to the ancient world and we should dig a little bit. So if we do some digging in the Bible, the first interesting thing that one discovers is that in the previous chapter, in chapter 10 in Genesis, we also read how the people dispersed all over the world. Language came into being while they were dispersed. And then in the next chapter, in chapter 11, we again have a reference to language and this confusion of language. So it seems like two different stories about how language came into being. What is actually interesting is the words are different, the Hebrew words. So the Hebrew word used in chapter 10, lashon, that word actually means tongues or languages. So that's the basic usual word for languages. And that's actually how we should understand it. And that's also scientifically how language is coming to being. It's when people dispersed all over the place, new languages come into being. We know that. But how then should we understand chapter 11, where a different word is used? Sapa. Now, this word is different. This is that confusion of language. So clearly something is going on here, and the biblical author is referring to something different than language. And the question is, what could he be referring to? Now, this word actually means lip or speech, but it's basically concerned with the way that words and phrases are pronounced. So that's the convention of pronunciation, the way that things are pronounced, that is important. So if there's a confusion of language, it means there's a confusion of the way of pronunciation. Now, one should ask, how on earth could something like that have happened? Now, what I propose is that what basically happened is towards the end of the Uruk period, something very interesting happened, and that was phonetic writing was discovered. So the first time in the history of the world, the Sumerians came to the point where they suddenly discovered that we could use a sign in a phonetic way. So let me just say how it happened. Before this happened, signs were used, symbolic signs, it was just a pictographic symbol referring to a particular object usually. And then it was mostly used for accounting purposes in Uruk in the earlier period. So for example, reference to sheep or whatsoever. And then we have the sign and we have a few next to it, the amount that's involved and so forth. But then the Sumerians come to the point where they understood that this sign also has a phonetic value. And if we use another sign with a different phonetic value and we use all the phonetic values, we can actually phonetically, in a wondrous way, describe what we're saying. So phonetic writing came into being. Now, previously, before this happened, all the people in ancient Sumer, the Sumerians, the Elamites, the Semites, all of them had the same way of pronouncing or understanding these symbols, these pictographic symbols, as referring to different objects, and everybody pronounced these objects differently. So everyone would read the sign and pronounce it differently in their own language. But once it's combined in a phonetic way, there was only one people who could understand that, and that was the Sumerians. The Semites couldn't understand it, the Elamites couldn't understand it, and shortly afterwards, the Elamites actually developed their version of phonetic language in reaction to what happened here in Uruk. So what happened is there must have been a massive, massive, massive confusion. Slightly before, everybody had the same convention, everybody was happy, and then suddenly the way of pronunciation changed. And with that came a massive, massive confusion.
And I can imagine if you've got people from different cultures trying to work together and building this platform, that confusion like that might have caused a lot of frustration.
Exactly, and it led to them stopping this whole project and becoming dispersed. And so that was also, with that, I think they understood this confusion obviously in religious terms. Today, we won't understand it in that way, but in their way of thinking, they understood it in religious terms. And from a biblical perspective, that was God that has intervened and stopped this project. And there's no way why we should not understand it in this way, because this is how God works. For example, at the time of the Exodus, he used the mighty wind to open the sea before the Israelites. God used natural events and these kind of events in his own way. So at that point in history, we can understand that God used this confusion to stop this project, which was actually, there's a lot to say about this project. Maybe at another time we can spend more time on that. But the point of the matter is that we can understand this confusion of language, not in the sense of new languages having come into being at this point in history, but as the way of pronunciation that has changed. It's consistent with the Hebrew word used, and it's consistent with that period in history, what happened there. So this is the way that I would like to understand it.
And it makes a lot of sense. Carel, do you have anything to add to that?
I was thinking, no, let me not go there. It is very interesting to understand, to have an insight in the history and what actually happened there. It describes the whole the history of the tower in a different way, but it makes a lot of sense. So there's no reason why it couldn't have been like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just from a theological point of view, and with reference to my previous question, Willie, if you look at any of these traditions, why would God feel it necessary to actually come down, if you look at it in terms of sort of the religious context, and stop this building project? Was it that it was a personal attack on God, or I don't know if you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. Before answering that question, I would just like to go back to the previous point.
Yes.
Many Christians believe that with their interpretation of the story as languages originating at the states in history, that's why they see the story. They believe this is the truth of the Bible. They do not understand. It's not the truth of the Bible. We can interpret this particular passage in various ways. And the one I'm presenting is consistent not only with the biblical text, but also with history. And it gives a historical perspective behind the story. And it makes sense of the story, also in terms of the world we're living in today. So what we're just discussing, it's a very sensible and a logical explanation.
I think it's a very important comment to make, that
yeah, and it doesn't
into historical context
in any way negate the inspiration of the Bible and God's message in the Bible and taking the word serious. We're actually really taking the word serious because we're digging deeper and deeper into the text, trying to get a better grip and understanding of the text. So that's actually taking the text serious. And that stands in contrast with people that just want to believe something from the text that they've been taught, and they're not really so interested in, doing further research and trying to understand it. But within terms of the ancient history, this, I think, is an explanation that makes sense. And it's important to me for reading, as we've already seen from Genesis 1 to 11. We've seen how all these biblical stories, once we discuss them in terms of the ancient world from which the Bible originated, they just make sense in a totally new way. And for people today, which is scientifically orientated, I believe the Bible should make sense. Now, we shouldn't adapt the Bible or try to interpret the Bible that it makes sense to scientifically orientated people, but good hermeneutics lead us at the same time to sensible interpretations that make sense for the people of our time.
Yeah, because I think as Christians and Bible believers, it puts us at a distinct disadvantage if we don't look at the historical context and we just look at how it's represented in the Bible. If you bring it into historical context, it's way more sensible, as we see. Carel.
And the mistake people often make is confusing their own interpretation for the truth of the Bible, thinking that the way they saw it, the way it has been taught, is actually how it happened, while that view is not properly tested in the biblical text and the ancient context.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, to return to your question about the purpose of this tower, on top of the tower, the sacred marriage was concluded. So they had a virgin that they put apart for a god, and in the previous discussion, we discussed the Nephilim. And we've seen that Nimrod, for example, is also being referred to in the Bible as one of these Nephilim figures. In fact, this family of Kish in the Bible is closely linked with the Nephilim, this mighty men of old. And so it was the reason for doing this is to generate this in their minds and in their perspectives, was to get the gods to be reincarnated on earth and to bring about these descendants, the Nephilim, that would, in the world to come, play a very important role. And from later editions, we've discussed the Nephilim in the previous discussion. we've seen how important the Nephilim was in biblical tradition. Perhaps not in the Bible. It's only referred to once in the Bible or twice in the Bible, but in Hebrew tradition, they were very important. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of the Giants, for example, were found there. The Book of Enoch, the 2 books of Enoch. So they were very important in Jewish tradition. And I believe to this day, they are very important. But this event, remember, we've seen that the Nephilim, in chapter 6, verse 4, when referring to the Nephilim, it says that they were on the earth before the deluge as well as after the deluge. And it was through this whole building project. And these towers, or this big, massive tower and platform it's actually a platform, not a tower, but I'm just using the biblical expression. So that they had this, it was a sacred place. It was a sanctuary, but this virgin was set apart for the gods. And they believe that the high priest, this spiritual being, it's in the story of Gilgamesh, is called an invisible being that came and had been with her. And then she produced this child, this Gilgamesh child, and he was not obviously not the only one. But this is actually the origin of the Nephilim. Is closely linked with the story of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Willie, just a bit of a curveball. According to tradition, Nimrod was human, but then he became a Nephilim. Do you have any comment around that? Is there any sort of reference to that in Sumerian tradition?
Yeah, in Sumerian tradition, this whole family of Meshkiach, so he was the forefather, the patriarch of the family of the Inkrem and Merkar, and there was quite an extended family that ruled. They were the ruling family of ancient Sumer in the period after the deluge. Now, what is interesting about them, they are, in Sumerian tradition, they are said to have been the descendants of the gods. It's clearly stated.
Yes.
In the Sumerian king list, we read that Meshkiach was a son of the sun god. They believe that they were sons and a people of the descendants, coins of the gods, and they're often referred to in this manner. And what is interesting, their descent from the sun god is also interesting. It's actually a very long story to discuss everything here.
We can probably do a whole podcast about that later.
Yeah, we should maybe one day, to see how things come together. But it has reference to the Sumerian word Udi. The D here is just reference. It's just a reference to divine. It's the divination of the U. U means shining.
Yes.
That's where Utu, that's the sun god, is derived from. And originally, we actually referred to the shining ones. It was believed that these shining ones had come and had been born on earth. So they associated them with the stars, but they also believed that they had been incarnated on earth in the period before the deluge, but also in this period we're talking about. It's a fascinating period in history, and in my coming book, I discuss this in some detail.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
as I've said, it's a long story. It's not so.
I find it fascinating how these themes repeat. So if you look at ancient Sumerian and you take it right through today, it keeps coming up. The one thing that I found very intriguing about your article is that you refer to the broken heel of the eagle, for instance. That was fascinating, and that sort of takes us back to the Garden of Eden as well. With the snake and so really interesting.
I think what we should do is we should comment the article, that people I think there's an article on my blog about some of these themes. I'll just give you the title and then they can go and read in more detail.
Do some additional reading. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but I don't think I've posted one on the Tower of Babel on the blog, but anyhow, some of these themes are definitely there.
Yes, absolutely. Carel, anything else to ask, or some some interesting comments from your side.
Thanks, Lebay. What is quite amazing to me is the similarities we find in the Sumerian tradition and the biblical account, also of the Tower of Babel. The whole effect of this event of Babel, how it all, the people just left it and abandoned it, and it was actually end of I think a line of king family or something. The Bible story corresponds so amazingly with this part of history, that it really confirms that the Bible is not, or the story of the Tower of Babel is not just a nice fairy tale, but it's actually rooted in history, and we can find the traces in the Sumerian history. That's quite amazing to me.
Yeah, without a doubt, without a doubt. Willie, do you have any concluding thoughts for us?
I think a lot of the criticism that has been ventured against the biblical text, especially the pre-naval history, is simply because people do not, the ancient world, it was discovered bits and pieces. So there was not a whole picture before the people 100 years ago or 150 years ago to compare the biblical narrative with. That didn't exist. Bits and pieces were discovered, people were thinking about it, and slowly but steadily a picture came together. So the reason why people do not believe that the biblical narrative is true is for the simple reason that when these things were intensely discussed in the scholarly community, this picture of the ancient world had not yet become clear. It was not yet so obvious, the close correspondence with the biblical narrative as it is today. Now, those scholars have made up their mind. They believe that it's been worked through. Everybody has been satisfied that everything, this is how we should understand it. But this is not correct, because their way of thinking was at that stage, 100 years back, when these themes were being thrust through, their way of thinking was very positivist. And that means they thought that if we cannot have proof, we cannot believe it. Today, in philosophical terms, nobody takes that serious. Well, there's still a few archaeologists that think in those terms, but scholars, of a philosophical orientation, philosophy of science and so forth, it's just nonsense. Nobody thinks you should take that serious, because it's very simple. You have not discovered something today, but how do you know you won't discover it tomorrow? And I've just shown how this picture has become clear. That was 100 years was not clear. People did not see this picture. Now we do see it. But now the scholars has made up their mind, and they're fixed in their ways. And that's not easy to change that. But the point of the matter is, it's just for Christians, it's a wonderful to just see how these things is consistent. The biblical stories that's been criticized from many corners, how it's consistent with history, and that we can really, we don't believe it because it's confirmed in history, but it's nice to know that it's confirmed in history.
Yes.
And I think for a modern world, many people that's in doubt about their faith, there's so many on the internet, there's so many things available. It's so easy to lose your faith in a time like this. And I think talks like this, is of great value to confirm to people that these stories could be taken seriously. And it's actually based in history, and we can believe them. And I would commend that people subscribe to the channel if they like the things that we're talking about, that they invite their friends, and that they maybe share it, and that we get a community together that's discussing these things and listening to these things and sharing these things, and get the message out to more and more people outside.
I can actually add to that. I mean, not everybody has a platform, but if you're open to this kind of thing and you find it interesting, and you don't just hold on to this old, I think, the traditionalist view. Use this. It's such an important topic. It's really, it's worthwhile communicating to people around you. And the other thing I wanted to add is we are not afraid to be asked questions. So if you have a question, even if you think it's strange or we might not be able to answer, throw it our way, and we can sit and we can have a discussion around it. We promise we won't shy away from anything like that. So yeah. Last words, Carel?
I would just like to thank my brother Willie for this is a lifetime of study and digging up these deep jewels in history that help us today to understand that the Bible is a very precious book, and what we find in the Bible we can actually believe. So thank you so much, Willie, for giving a big part of your life to open up these treasures for us.
Yeah, I can also say thank you very much for that, Willie. I think, as usual, I will post all of the links, but I think what I'll do as well is have a conversation with Willie afterwards, and then just with reference to, the Tower of Babel and some additional bits and pieces to get that as well, and just post it as a link. So yeah, but thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks,
and I look forward to the next one.
Yes.
That's really